All right, well, good morning, everyone. Welcome to our panel. My name is Christine Malott. I'm going to be the panel moderator today. I am an Anishinaabe educator, proud member of Swan Lake First Nation. I currently teach high school at the University of Winnipeg Collegiate, English and Global Issues, and more recently I stepped into the role of Associate Publisher at Portage and Main Press. Woo! So I'm super honored to moderate this panel today. This panel is on the topic of resistance narratives and Indigenous representation in comics. So today we'll be hearing from three incredible creators who have woven resistance and Indigenous identity into their graphic novels. So I'll begin by asking each of our panelists to introduce themselves and their latest book with Tidewater Press. So we can maybe start this way.
Okay. Hello, my name's Dave Robertson, and I'm a Cree from Norway House. I live in Winnipeg. I have 5 kids, and I've been writing for about 14 years. My first book got published with Portage and Main Press, Tidewater Press, 2010. It was a series called 7 Generations. So I started off with comics, and I've been doing comics ever since. And all my graphic novels have been with Tidewater Press. And the last, it feels like forever, for the last like 4 or 5 years, we've been working on this Reckon or Rise, this graphic novel series. So we just had the 3rd book in the series come out, and it's a continuation of a young adult trilogy called The Reckoner. And I've always envisioned it to continue as a comic series. And so this is the realization of that hope that we would be the graphic novel series. It's just about this guy named Cole Harper, and he is imbued with these powers, and he is fighting against this like nefarious, mega elaborate lab that's evil called Eco Laboratories, and they're trying to create villains with this serum, and Cole and his buddies are trying to defeat this lab to squash this threat that is facing not only them, but other Indigenous groups across Canada, across Turtle Island, and yeah, so it's about a lot. I'm sure we'll get into a lot of it. But the third book that just came out is called God Flare, which is the name of the serum that is creating these powers within the people, good people, and the not bad people, but the used people, I would say. So yeah.
Good morning, everyone. My name is Tasha Spillett, and I'm Afro Indigenous. My Cree side is from the Pasquet Cree Nation and Cumberland House Cree Nation. And I have Trinidadian ancestry as well. And I live in Winnipeg, born and raised here in Winnipeg. I have a daughter. Her name is Isabella Kishkoyavik. She's 4, and she's lent me to you today against her will. I'm the author of the Surviving the City series. The 3rd one, the official one for the 3rd and final volume of that series was last night, along with the book from Dave, Saudi Valentine, Albert McLeod, and Jennifer Storm also had their book launches last night. The Surviving the City series is about being an urban Indigenous youth here in Winnipeg, and yeah, I'm glad to talk more about that as the conversation continues.
I'm Ryan Howe. I'm not Indigenous. I'm the author, or not the author, excuse me.
Wow.
I'm the illustrator of the page.
Yeah. Oh my God, let's just start with the corporation from the White House.
I'm the illustrator of Little Moons. The author is Jennifer Storm. And it's a book about missing and murdered Indigenous women. The main character's sister goes missing, and it's about how her and her little brother kind of deal with not knowing what's happened to her, right? There's a little bit of a paranormal element to it that's wonderful. It's a really touching story.
Awesome. So I'm going to ask 2 group questions for each of you to answer, and then we'll get into some more individual questions. So my first group question is, in many ways, comics offer a unique medium for storytelling. As a writer or an artist, can you tell us about how you work with your collaborator to create both a verbal and visual story that actively resists colonial narratives and reclaims Indigenous voices.
A long question.
I guess essentially what I'm asking is that collaboration process, like how is that for you? And maybe we'll start with Ryan, if you don't mind.
No, that's totally fine. So as the illustrator, I come in after the story's done, right? Like the story is pretty much scripted, it's complete. There might be some tweaks, but for the most part, it's laid out for me. So my experience is probably fairly different, right? At that point, I'm going through the story. My task with my collaborator, the writer, and my editor is working through the visual look of everything, right? So establishing characters, locations, how they dress, how they interact with each other, how they interact with the story at large. So because I'm not Indigenous, for accuracy, I'm doing a ton of research. We have cultural checks and stuff as well, so anything I reference is accurate. And it's really interesting. It's often difficult to find reference, because reference material tends to be really large in scope, and a lot of people have experience. So the smaller, more granular you get with anything, the harder it is to find. So it's a very collaborative effort with my writer to make sure that her vision is coming through, as well as storytelling from my perspective is coming through as well. So that my job is really to give the best possible representation of her story ideas that I can. Right, so there's also an aspect too, back and forth, where she might write it one way, and when I'm breaking it down to panels and story flow, saying, what if we tweak it a little bit this way? What if we focus on this character and that character? We break the panels up something different. So it's a really wonderful back and forth.
It's very interesting to hear, and it makes me think that I'm not quite doing this thing right. So I really subscribe to stay in my own lane, and I know that I have no illustration skills at all. And so I don't, like your question asked about collaboration, I don't necessarily engage in a really hands-on collaborative relationship with any of my illustrators to this point. I feel like I offer the text, and I'm very mindful in how I offer the text, and I provide some guidance. But I really believe that illustrators are gifted storytellers in their own right, and I just kind of had this very trusting process where they do their storytelling with the text. And so far it's worked out really well. Which I'm lucky for. The one thing that I will say is I've been to this point, it might change, very purposeful in working with the editor. My editor for this, the newest volume is Irene, and she's here. Working with the editor to ask for an illustrator who, for Surviving the City series, I was very specific that I wanted to work with an Indigenous woman. That was really important to me. As a new writer, and I didn't quite have all the trust in the world yet, I wanted to make sure I was working with somebody who had a community accountability to the story, the content of the story. It was important to me that I work with somebody who knew that they had to tend to the characters like they were their own blood relatives. And so that's why I was very specific in kind of the illustrator that I wanted to work with. And that's changed as my writing has developed, and I developed more of a sense of trust with my publishers and my editors. So I don't really have like a huge oh no, I want you to put this here, or I want you to change that. There were some tweaks in the beginning, but we ironed those kind of things out. In terms of how Indigenous people, mine is very contextual to the prairies. So my illustrator on this project is from BC. And so some of the physical characteristics of the characters weren't landing for people that you might see on the prairies. So some of those things had to be massaged out. But other than that, I know I'm a stick person. I'm a stick person drawer. And so I just, trust their process.
Yeah, so The Reckoner Rises, I worked with Scott for a long time. So I mentioned 7 Generations. I worked with Scott on that 4-book series. And if I had to count very quickly, I think I probably worked with Scott on like 14, 15 graphic novels, something like that. So we had a long-standing relationship, and that has, I mentioned this last night if you weren't there last night, but it's definitely built in us a lot of trust, not only in how we tell stories, because we're both very visual storytellers, but in the trust that I have for Scott to realize the vision that I have for the story, and also to make sure that what he's drawing is faithful to like the thematic elements that I want to convey in the script. And so like how we've always worked, Scott and I, is I develop a very detailed script. So they've gotten probably less detailed as we've developed our relationship. When I started out, I'd probably write like a 45 page script for a 30-page comic. And it would be everything, like, here's this guy's elbows over here, like this, and then, everything would be laid out in every single panel. I'd even like write how I want panels to be shaped, the length of panels, everything. So I had a very specific vision for it. And Scott, over time, we've kind of developed a system where he will take my script and he will storyboard it all out. And once he's storyboarded it all out, he will often give me different options for every page if he sees ways that he can render the script in a more effective way. And so we'll kind of either on the phone or email or sometimes we used to like stop and go to Starbucks or something and sit down and look through them all. We'll just go through them page by page, and we'll look at like what's working, what isn't. He'll show me the different options, and it's all for the service of the story. And once we finalize what that is going to be, then he'll start going into penciling and then inking and stuff like that. But yeah, so it's a very collaborative. And one of the things that I've learned as a writer in my time doing graphic novels and picture books as well is that the illustrator is as much a storyteller as the writer. And so you have to recognize that I think you just have to leave your ego out of it. And Irene showed this great slide earlier where there was no captions, there was like no speech bubbles, and you have to be okay with someone reading that script and seeing a page with no words, and maybe thinking, what did David actually write here? Because if the words don't serve the story, you have to leave them out of the script, out of the book. So I think it is letting go of the ego of being a writer and giving yourself up to the service of the story. And so you have to work with really good creators for that. Scott is definitely one of the best. And I think there's a lot of trust there in him as a non-Indigenous person, being able to realize also as you had mentioned, all the different like resistance narratives and the different elements of representation in the story. And Scott definitely does a lot of work, and sometimes I give him the work. But a lot of times he does it on his own, on making sure that there's an authenticity to everything he's doing. And of course, there's obviously checkpoints that also help out, whether it's like cultural reviews or whatever it might be. So, but it's all a very, very collaborative process that we've developed over the course of almost like 15 years. It's crazy. But, yeah.
It's funny too to say like he does research and finds and stuff, right?
Yeah.
I find a lot of times writers will I've referenced like 2 or 3 photos.
Yeah.
Because in their minds it's exactly what it is, and then your folder ends up being like 30 to 40 to 60 because you're thinking of like angles and framing and stuff that iterates down the line. And it's really interesting to see how that kind of bounces back and forth.
Yeah.
Different creators.
I'll sometimes give Scott like I'll tell him watch this music video.
Yeah.
And listen and watch this music video like 10, 15 times. So you have an idea of like the tone and the pacing of the story. Yeah. So we did a graphic novel for like Newfoundland and Labrador, and I told him to watch like Holocene by Bon Iver like I think 10 times. And when he did that, he was able to render the first 10 pages of the script based on the tonality of this music video. So it's very cool, and he did it. So yeah, it's really, really neat.
It's awesome.
Yeah.
Wow. Yeah, as someone who mainly I would consider myself a consumer of this up until about a month ago. it's really interesting to hear the behind the scenes workings and how it's collaborating and how it all comes together so well. My next question for all of you is about how the characters in your books are layered and complex, challenging one-dimensional stereotypes or representations of Indigenous people. Could you share how you developed these characters, either verbally or visually, to reflect multifaceted Indigenous identities?
Oh my goodness. I'll go. Okay. Questions. That's a really beautiful question. So when I was thinking about the characters for Survive in the City, I wanted them, like, I was very intentional in not having them represent kind of a monolith of Indigenous identity, because I think that that is really dangerous for both settler folks, because then they just don't know how to be in relationship with the diverse Indigenous community that we are. But more so for Indigenous folks to think that we have to be one singular way. And then if we're outside of that singular way, then we're somehow, our experience is invalidated. And, you know, I think maybe especially as a person with mixed heritage, that was particularly important for me, to show that Indigenous characters can look, sound, think in various ways. My characters are like little shit disturbers, I feel like, and I really wanted them to do that work to unsettle particularly what is held as traditional within our community. So I grew up in what probably people would consider a very traditional upbringing with access to ceremony, and that has been a really huge part of the foundation of my identity. But there also is some really tricky things that happen within when identity is so firmly constructed in a particular way. So what becomes traditional is really held with like X, Y, Z. This is traditional. Like if you are traditional, you have to smudge. You have to smudge in this particular order. You have to smudge using this particular medicines at this particular time. And the reality is that like we all have different relationships depending on our context, the way we've grown up, with these things that are held as traditional. So my characters kind of do the work of asking these hard questions. Why do we do this? Why do women have to sit in this particular wedding ceremony? Why do people have to wear this particular form of clothes to enter into a ceremonial space? And I did this because, especially for urban youth, so I'll backtrack. We know that for urban Indigenous youth, cultural connection is one of the #1 protective factors that keep our young people away from all the things that we don't want to happen to them. The violences, suicide, problematic substance use, all the hard things. We know that connecting them culturally and creating that sense of belonging in the community is the #1 way to save lives. But at the same time, we don't often do a really good job at lowering the barriers that we set. So in making sure that access to ceremony, access to community, access to culture is really open. And so the characters in my book ask those questions that you're not supposed to ask, that you're taught you're not supposed to ask elders or knowledge keepers. Why? How come? And I wanted to do that so that we can, we talk about safe spaces. We can really make sure that the circles that we make are super accessible for young people.
Oh, I guess I can go. You can go last this time. I don't know. I think there's different elements here. One of them is just the element of like writing good characters, like in a literary setting. So you want to make sure that you're creating characters with a lot of depth, flaws, relatability, so that readers, when they see these characters, even if they're a non-Indigenous reader reading an Indigenous character, that there's things that they can connect to, and things that they can learn. And so one of the touch points with Cole Harper is that he's someone who deals with mental health struggles, and I have found there's been so many connections that readers have made with that, whether they're Indigenous or non-Indigenous. And so I think the relatability and connectivity of the characters and the depth that you give them is very important. And I had a bit of a head start doing the Reckoner Rises because I'd already created all these characters, most of them anyway, in the Reckoner trilogy, the novels. And I did a lot of work in developing these characters, making sure that they had their own distinct personalities and backgrounds and familial backgrounds and stuff like that. And that was very important for me. So, and I think the other levels are, you have these characters that are, you kind of juxtapose against the tropes of superhero. For me, Cole was someone who I didn't want him to conform to the expectations of what an Indigenous superhero might be. And what I mean by that is, usually Indigenous superheroes, historically at least, they have tight pants and they're bare chested and they have a headdress and they maybe have like a spear or a bow and arrow and they're very they're very typical. Like Black Bison Firestorm is a very typical example of that. And they always usually have shamanistic powers. And so I didn't want Cole to have any shamanistic powers, any stereotypically Indigenous powers. And I didn't want him to be dressed like how you'd expect an Indigenous superhero to be dressed by the expectations that have been formed over the course of decades through the appropriation and misrepresentation of Indigenous cultures. So Cole just wears like a mask and like jeans and I think he wears like a skeletal ribbed sweatshirt of some kind. I can't picture him properly right now, but so and his powers are very much stereotypical, but not in an Indigenous sense, but stereotypical powers. He's very much regenerative powers. He's very strong. So they're all very like Wolverine kind of Deadpool kind of things, but they're not like he can reanimate stuffed animals and he can conjure the spirits of his ancestors and that sort of thing. So I think that was very important for me to break out of that mold. And I think Eva, who's Cole's girlfriend, is also a very important character because the sexualization or romanticization of Indigenous women, in pop culture was something I desperately wanted to change. And so Eva's someone who, she is completely self-assured. She is strong and confident. She doesn't need Cole to be powerful. In fact, in the second book, she is actually the hero of that story. And she never wears skimpy clothing. And I think that is a really problematic in how we sexualize Indigenous women in pop culture and comics. It's led to a lot of issues, and I think it's contributed to things like MMIWT2S. And so I wanted her to just be this confident, strong character that didn't need, any of the kind of the typical things that Indigenous characters need in pop culture to, be noticed or be successful, or and so that Eva was a very important character for that as well. And then I think just then you have to have diversity in the backgrounds of the characters that you create because they're all from the same community. And so Cole, his parents were both killed, and that's not spoiler. And it might be that happened before the first book even happened. And Eva's mother left her and her dad. And so and Cole has mental health struggles. Eva doesn't. And so there's all these different, different character backgrounds and different, states of mind of the characters and all these different, a lot of diversity in the character development and who the characters are and how they talk and all these things that gives you a lot to connect to and a lot to learn and a lot to a lot to follow, and I think it all leads to authenticity in the development and the lives of the characters within the stories that you create. So that was a long answer, I'm sorry.
No, that's fine. That's great.
I think in a way, my job's actually easier than the writers because you guys are essentially creating stuff out of whole cloth, right? The characters are coming up, you're giving them their life, right? For me, when I'm looking at the characters, I have the script in front of me. I know what's going to happen. I'm basically told how these characters interact and relate with each other. So for my role, what I'm doing is I'm breaking down each character. A lot of times it's really helpful the writer will give me a description of kind of the clothing they're into, their personalities, what they kind of gravitate towards. So I make sure that I kind of populate their wardrobes and their life and their rooms and their environments with those items. So you have visual cues. So even if it's not in the writing, there's, you're getting those nonverbal cues for what these people are doing, right? And how they're approaching the world around them. So I'm happy that I don't have to do that legwork of like establishing those people, but it's nice to be able to bring that second layer to stuff and say like, these are the people, these are, giving that, sorry, back up, it's been a long morning. The body language, right? With comics especially, it's a very simplified drawing style, right? For myself, I'm not realistic, I'm not cartoony, I'm kind of somewhere in the middle, right? So I worked really hard to make sure that everybody doesn't have the same face, right? You don't want all your women to look the same, you don't want all your men to look the same, you don't want the only differentiation to be like, this person has wrinkles so I know he's older, or she's dressed a little younger, but she's really in like her 30s, right? So I try to be really conscious that everybody is distinct. So when you're looking at a panel, you know who that person is, not just because of the way they wear their hair or something, right? This is how they act, panel to panel. You kind of expect that they're gonna do this. It's not a weird jarring transition just because I'm trying to cram something in because I know how to draw it that way, right? So that's part of what I absolutely love about comics is every character's different, even if they kind of come from similar backgrounds. That person looks at the world differently. How do you represent that element?
Awesome. Thank you so much. And yeah, no, I really appreciate the elaborate answers. We have a young comic writer in the room today, and I know he's listening so intently and probably learning so much from you. Great. I'll go on and we ask some questions now. We'll start with you, David. In The Reckoner Rises, Gobbler, what role does humor play in your storytelling? It was something that stood out to me when I was reading.
Was it like something that Josh does? The coyote?
Yes, the coyote in particular.
He is the comic relief. I think just generally, like with Indigenous storytelling, humor plays a big role in how we tell stories. And so I wanted to make sure that I was infusing humor into the stories without taking away from the narrative or the dramatic, momentum of each graphic novel. And so, like, most of the humor in these stories comes from a trickster being, which has been present for all of the books. His name's Chotch. He's a coyote. And he calls himself Chotch, or Mr. Chochnov, which is just, they didn't read the books, I guess, but, and so he's the guy who can go into the story, he can drop his own Easter eggs that he's present, he can break the fourth wall when he wants, he talks to me often when I'm writing the story, literally from the book he talks to me, and so he kind of exists like, in almost like an omnipotent way where he can exist within this world and the world where the comic is taking place, and he kind of is in some space in between. And it was really interesting because when I was writing the Reckoner trilogy, the late Harold Johnson was emailed me, and he had read, I think, one of the Reckoner books, and he had read Chotch, who's this coyote trickster. He also, by the way, is very aware that he's not supposed to be in a Cree story because he's, coyote is not a Cree trickster. So he explains why. So Harold emailed me and he was like, I had a similar experience as you writing a trickster. And that's where we were writing these stories and all of a sudden the trickster that we were writing kind of took over the story and started to do their own things and talk to us. And we had to kind of just manage them rather than write them because they were kind of doing all this shit. I'm sorry. Though. We still read my books. I'll read your books. So he's doing all these things I couldn't control. I literally lost control of this character. So you just have to figure out a way to rein them in and to manage their presence as best you can, because they really do take on a life of their own. And Harold and I were talking a lot about that via email. It was very, very interesting. So the Coyote Chotch is the source of comedy in this series. I think for the most part, almost exclusively, because otherwise it's a very scary, action-packed, kind of thrilling story. So he gives a bit of that levity, I think.
Yeah, I definitely appreciated that while reading the story. Tasha, I'd like to ask you about your approach to the character Gingbig, an Afro-Indigenous character in We Are the Medicine. Why was it important to you to include a character of Afro-Indigenous descent in your book? And what do you hope readers will gain from seeing that?
Thank you. So I think I have to say that this series happened over many years. And so I first started writing this series, I don't know, Catherine, it was like, it's been a while, like
2016?
yeah, so it's getting up there. And so the text of the first two, I'm just a different person. The person who wrote this last book and the books that I'm writing right now, and the person who wrote the first two are just significantly different humans. You know, the world is different. I am literally different as somebody, like, I became a parent in that time. I finished my doctoral degree in that time, like so many life shifts. And so when I went to write the third, I had to do so carefully because I still had to, you know, show the progression of these characters who are already living, who are out in the world, but I was writing them from a totally different vantage point. And so Ginebig came because in the pandemic, when I was doing many classroom visits virtually, I was talking to a group of young people, young students, and they're from the East Coast. And so I did my usual spiel, talking about graphic novels, talking about surviving the city, and then I came around to the Q&A period. And a young person asked the question, why are there no visibly recognizable Afro-Indigenous characters in your book? And I thought, oh my God, I got it wrong. And I really had, like, the question at the time, it was like one of those moments when you're kind of just like shaken. And I just paused and the best answer that I could come up with was a non-answer. And I said, I'm sorry, you're absolutely right. I have not done the job that I was supposed to do. The job, like, I need to do better. And so for some reason, and I can't really map out for you right now why there's many diverse characters in the graphic novel series, but there was no specific character that explored what Afro-Indigeneity was. And that person wouldn't have even probably come into my brain unless this young person asked this very pointed and amazing question, important question. So I thought, holy heck, I need to get back. I need to create this character. So Ginebig is an Afro-Indigenous character that we meet in volume 3. And he's from the res, he grew up on the res, and he makes his way into the city. And Ginebig means snake in Anishinaabe. And it was actually, when I was pregnant, it was going to be the name, if we had a boy, that was going to be the name of our male, we had a girl, but if we had a boy, that was gonna be his name. And I remember when we told my daughter's dad, when we told his dad, like, if we have a boy, this is what we're gonna name it, his reaction was like, uh-oh. Like, he was very against that name. And he comes from, my daughter's father comes from a really Christianized community. And many of our communities are very Christianized. And the whole characterization of the snake is so heavily, there's so many negative connotations based on biblical references. But from having the upbringing that I had, I was taught that a snake is one of the most sacred creatures because it moves closest to the medicine. And so when I thought about needing to heal this gap in the story that I had neglected to fill for the readers, that's when Ginebig came. So to kind of bring the medicine. And so he's in the city. I don't want to give too many spoilers, but things happen in the city, and he eventually wants to go back home. And so he does that work of kind of like upsetting when we go back to the other question around identity, what an Indigenous person is, where do Indigenous people belong, the kind of mobility that often many of us have between our urban homes and how we refer to our home communities, even if we've never lived in our home communities, it's often people will say, you know, like Christine and David and myself have done in our introductions, we still call back to our homes. And I think that's such an important part of how we contextualize ourselves. And I personally do, I won't speak to my friends here, but I personally do it because it grounds me in the accountability that when I stand here and I share what I have to share, it reminds me that no matter what, first and foremost, I'm accountable to my nation, I'm accountable to the land, I'm accountable to my community. And so that informs what I say. It also informed in the creation of Geneva, because I'm accountable to the Afro-Indigenous community, which is, you know, people love having babies, so we are a growing population. Whereas growing up in the prairies in the 90s, like I think there was like 3 other families that I knew had Afro-Indigenous children in them, and I can name them. We grew up knowing each other, of each other. But now there's like literally so many Afro-Indigenous children. And it was really important, like as somebody who's like getting up there in the generations, it was important for me to begin to create content so that other people know that their experience is valid.
Awesome. And you do such a great job of portraying that in the novel. So
Thank you.
Ryan, finally your time. Your illustrations in Little Moons brings to life a complex historical and contemporary Indigenous story. Especially murdered and missing Indigenous women and girls and Two-Spirit people. Can you tell us about how you worked with Jen Storm to create this authentic representation of the characters in your book?
Yeah, so it was really great because speaking back to like reference material, she provided a lot. Like there's a smudging scene that she actually sent me 2 or 3 videos that was basically a really nice, just like kind of step by step. This is all I was able to source more close-up details of different items used, things like that. So I was able to get a little more, I guess, a head start on research, which is great, right? She was really good all through it too. There's sequences for beading and like the dance regalia and things like that. She had a ton of resources for that. So I was able to understand how those all kind of came together, because there's a couple of little sequences of really detailed beading demonstrations between the grandmother and the mother, and there's just all little close-up hands kind of going through everything. And artists, for the most part, don't like doing hands and there's a lot of joints and hands are moving. But when you understand and you can watch somebody do it 5 or 6 or 10 times, you understand that it's kind of like a dance. You kind of see where things are supposed to be, and you can draw them to that point. Because from art, there's a couple things that don't happen. Like we control time, but we can't do very, very small amounts of time in sequence, right? Like I can't do a hand going through a movement. You can't draw somebody shrugging. It's either this or it's either that. So somebody's doing a complex movement, what parts of that am I able to take out to get the point across to actually demonstrate what's happening, right? A similar thing too with the dance and the regalia, all the intricate beadwork, if I drew that, it would look so wildly out of sync with all my other art because it would be so very detailed and very small. The colors wouldn't represent because you've got the black outlines for all the color holds. So it was a lot of establishment back and forth with her to figure out what was kind of a happy medium that would demonstrate what we're trying to get across versus where we kind of have to limit it so it's not just kind of a sludge of color on the page, right? Because if you don't know, most comic artists draw about 157 to like 160% of the size, and we shrink the pages down for the actual work, right? So if we do like beadwork, it's either really big to start with or it's really tall, and when you shrink it, it gets really weird. So yeah, working with her is great because it's kind of finding those midpoints that would allow the storytelling to be as seamless as possible.
Yeah, and I love how the concept like the beading kind of continues as a theme throughout the story.
That beading sequence is the one I was most nervous about because it is fine work, and I'm so pleased with kind of how that page came out. Which sounds like I'm just blowing my own horn on that, but like it's one of those things as an artist that you're like, I'm very happy that the thing that was up here came out down here, and that everybody else gets to experience.
So as we wrap up, before we get into the Q&A, I would love to hear from each of you about what's next. What projects are you currently working on? Where can our audience connect with you this weekend? Brian, we'll start with you.
I actually just finished inking this time another project with Howe that I don't know if it's been announced, so I'm not going to go any more into that. It'll come out soon, which is really nice because it was a really fun one. And like from an artist standpoint, inking another person's work is wildly different than doing both the penciling and the inking of it. So you bring something of yourself, obliterating those original line art. I've also got a bunch of my own books that I self-publish. I kind of do as webcomics week to week because you don't want your skills to lapse. So webcomics are a wonderful way of just kind of doing as much as you want. And then, 6 months later, you have a book and it kicks out one row, which is nice. So yeah, I'm just upstairs on the exhibitor floor with all that fun stuff.
So, Tasha, what about you?
Well, I'm writing a book. I'm working on a novel, YA novel. First manuscript is done. I'm in the editing process, which is, I actually really love the editing process. So that's going well.
Oh, good.
Yeah, you'll see it soon. You'll see it eventually. What is next? I have I have a picture book called The Raven's Ribbons. It comes out in January and it's published by Little Brown, which I'm excited but nervous about the reception of that one, but I'm excited about that one. Some other books, manuscripts out to my agent. I really want to win a government general's award. I'm just putting it out there. So, manifest. Put all your energy into that one. But yeah, editing right now.
So, and where can our audience find you?
Oh, you cannot find me this weekend because I am going home to my baby after my friend gets his panel. But I'm trying to be more into social media on the book end. So we can find me on Instagram, Tasha Spillett, at Tasha Spillett. And I'm trying to post more about the writing process, and kind of the behind the scenes of being an author, just to take away any unknowns for people who are interested in writing.
Awesome, thank you. And David, what about you?
I'm not working on it anymore, but the fourth book in this series, Scott is now going to eventually be working on. So that's going to be the finale of The Revenant Rises. And I don't think that's up for like 3 years, literally. But the stuff I have coming out next year is I have a mental health memoir coming out in January called All the Little Monsters. And I have a kind of like a guide to reconciliation called 52 Ways to Reconcile. It's coming out in the spring. And I have a picture book called Little Shoes, which is coming out in the summer, which is a book that is about the unmarked graves and how to talk to kids about all the questions they're going to have about that. And it's hard, so I wanted to give parents and teachers a bit of a guide to a story. And then I guess finally I have the last book in this Misawa Saga series, which is my fantasy series, which will be out in August as well next year. So next year is a busy year for me, but that's what I have coming out in the next year. And then other than that, I'm working on publishing other books with an imprint I started with Penguin Random House. And you can find me on Instagram, David Robertson Writer, and on Twitter at I'm never going to call it X. At Dave Alex Roberts. So, but I'm not going to be around here for very much longer this weekend. So you can find me on social media.
Can I have one comment to that? I love that you're offering the concepts behind writing and stuff like that. Comics is such a wonderful thing, and I've noticed the community is amazing. Unlike most creative industries, we don't tend to hold secrets. We all tend to help each other out. And as a new creator, you feel intimidation to that. But if you ask for it, most people will be happy to share how they do stuff. Nobody kind of hoards that knowledge like a dragon on a pile of gold. It's like, well, of course, this is how you do it. And it's great because you can see, I don't have to write full script. I don't have to do limited script. I can do whatever I want, or I don't have to draw this way or that way. So that's fantastic to have those resources out there.
Thank you for that. We'd like to open it up to our audience members now. Does anybody have a question for one or more of our panelists?
As creators, when you think and you believe you have a brilliant idea, how do you handle rejection or criticism on your work?
Well, I want to go. Okay. Oh, so I like to tell this. So My first picture book ended up on the New York Times bestseller list. And this is kind of an interesting, so the manuscript of that one I shared with somebody that I love, and that person passed on that manuscript. And I felt like it was my first rejection, and I was like, oh darn, that kind of stung. And then I was like, you know what, this story is gonna find its home, and I just believed in the story, and so I gave it to the next person. That person loved it, and it ended up on the New York Times bestseller list. But had I took the first rejection very personally and had I let it harm me, there are no rejections, there are only redirections. I think Oprah said that. But, you just never know. One of the most beautiful things about writing is you literally never know where the story will go. And I really think that for myself, I really think that authors are just vessels for stories that need to be told. And so sometimes it's going to find the right place right away, and sometimes it will take time. I actually, part of my personal writing process is writing in the public library by my house, because I like writing my stories where there are other stories are existing. And when I was really struggling with writing the manuscript for the novel I'm writing for the Day's imprint, I was trying so hard to get the story out and it wasn't coming. And then there was kind of a moment sitting in the library surrounded by all the books and realizing that not every single book on all these shelves is that person's best book. And that was such a humbling but also gentle way that I just had to move the story through, and it's gonna become what it's gonna become, and I'll do my best. But so not every book on the shelves is that author's best book, but it's somebody's favorite book. And so I think that that's really important, just to remember that the story was given to all of us for a reason, and we have a responsibility to bring it into the world, but where it will go, we don't know.
There's an interesting thing too that I find that people that aren't naturally creative, their language for creativity can be very limited, right? So it might not be the criticism they're trying to express sometimes, or the rejection of it, but it's how they're trying to express it. So I find a lot of times if somebody gives me a criticism, I try to listen to it and then get to the heart of whether it's a valid criticism or if it's a personal just dislike. It just might not be, like you said, a book for them. It might be somebody else's favorite book. So that way, if it's visual, if it's story, do I need to fix this? Do I need to tweak it? Or is it just something I just need to put on a shelf somewhere, don't worry about it, and go forward? If enough people bring it up, maybe it's something, but otherwise, it just might be just that person on that. The next day, they might absolutely love it. It just might be something in their life. They're just not digging it that day.
I don't have much to add. I just think my rejections come at the agent level. So my agent Jackie will just be like, that's just total crap, Dave. Don't bother with that. Or Jackie, I have this great idea with this vegan vampire. She's like, that's so dumb. You're not gonna do that. And so okay, I'll just I won't do it. So I'm lucky at this stage of my career, most stuff that I bring forward to publisher gets done. But that wasn't always that way. It's you build up to the point where, but yeah, Jackie definitely is good at filtering out the bad ideas. But yeah, what Ryan was saying about the criticism, I think you just have to understand where the criticism is coming from. And so, you have to be able to accept valid criticism and help it to make you a better writer. And just don't go to Goodreads, because they'll be oh, Theory of Prose, there's not any words I'd look up in the dictionary, so this book sucks. So I'm that's not really a good criticism. I don't want people to have to look up words to understand what I'm saying. So so I think you have to realize where the criticism is coming from and learn how to either take the criticism or how to agree to disagree, or just to not even look for it at all. So I think, but I don't have much to add other than that.
I'm a graphic designer, and I had a boss once that did not like blue. If you put blue in it, she'd throw it out. You change it to red, she's like, I'm great with that. I'm like, why? We can use. So yeah.
I saw one more question.
Thank you for speaking with us today. Each of you addressed a gap that you saw in literature and addressed it through your work, whether it was a different kind of superhero or a different kind of identity. I'm wondering, what is a gap you still see in representation or in this literature that you would like to see filled in the future?
I think it's just volume. I think, we're still at the point in Canada where we want to get to the point where we're at parity in the amount of Indigenous stories that are being written by Indigenous writers. We're definitely in Canada further along than the States, but we still have a long way to go. And so I think that we've had what Richard Van Camp would say is a renaissance in Indigenous literature the last decade or so, but not to rest on our laurels and realize that there's so many more stories to tell. I think that, like, for me, what I see in the publishing world and the writing world is that there's a movement now to not only tell stories of trauma and stories of the historical things that we've been through, the contemporary struggles that we have as Indigenous people, but there's so much value in stories of beauty in our culture, our communities, and our language. And I think those things should be celebrated and those stories should be told. And I think they are just as important on this path to reconciliation as the other stories. And I think we need to find a better balance of the stories that we're telling. And I've tried to do that in my own career, and I see it happening in literature generally. So, but I think that is the gap that I see, and I think it's being filled slowly. But I mean, this is a marathon we're running; it's not a sprint. So, I think Canada's doing quite well generally, and I think that I see that trend continuing because people want to read Indigenous literature. You look at the bestseller list every week. It's populated by Indigenous books, and that is not because it's a charity where people are like, oh, I should buy this book because it's by an Indigenous writer. It's because they want to read a good story, and so and we see that played out week after week after week. So it's very encouraging. I think I choose to be hopeful about the direction we're headed in. There will always be setbacks, but I think that generally we're doing pretty well. So.
Very much an outsider perspective, but I know when we were growing up, we knew nothing. Nothing was taught, right? Like even finding out as an adult when the last residential school in Saskatchewan closed, was oh God, that was not what we were told. But I see with my kids, as more and more comics are published in the younger series and the YA series, and they have even more adult books as well coming up. They love graphic novels and they gravitate towards it, and they're just so much more educated. To see more stories out there is absolutely amazing for them because it's just such a natural way to get information into them. So like you said, more hopeful stories and things like that too. You can just kind of see their life. I had one of those stories in 150 Years Retold. Mm-hmm. And my kids never read my stuff, or they're like, I saw your book in the library, they took it and they read the thing. And I'm like, that's fantastic, right?
Mm-hmm. I agree with Dave, talking more about our joy and our beauty. And I think that actually does go this panel's about resistance. I think that is actually the most skillful form of resistance, is to live well, to love each other, to feed ourselves well, to tend to one another. And I think that actually is more effective than I think it's very effective towards our liberation. Personally, I would really love to see more stories that speak to the experience of women, particularly mothers, and that's just the stage of life that I'm in right now. I feel like there's not a whole lot that talks honestly about what it is to be a mother, especially as somebody who had a child during the pandemic, in which there was we were in total isolation, and they say it takes a village to raise a child. There was certainly no village, but I just don't think there is a village for parents who are trying to raise children, who are trying to raise fully connected children. And so I would really like to see more, and I find myself gravitating more towards just really real stories that are not, trying to create this very pretty picture, because I don't think we can breathe in that. And I want to create stories where people feel that they can breathe and feel more okay in their own skin.
That's interesting too, because North American comics were severely stunted by superheroes, right? Superheroes are great, but for various reasons they killed every other genre of superheroes for a long time. And you see how many kids in school now just Like Dogman was the highest selling graphic novel and novel on multiple lists for a while, and I'm like, that's amazing. And those readers now know, like in Europe and Japan, there's other genres besides superheroes. So those spaces, you see them creeping in now, and I think in like, 10 years when those readers become consumers at a level significantly more disposable income, they're going to be looking for those stories, and I think you're going to see it populate out, which is very exciting.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much for sharing all of your insights and creative processes. Make sure to thank the books and audience. They're available here at our table. So, thank you so much.
I was just wondering how old were you when you wrote your first book and what was it?
Like when I wrote my first book that was published, or when I wrote my first book, period.
Your first book.
I wrote my first book when I was 8 years old. I was like it was a poetry book. I was in grade 3, and I just wrote I think it was about 10 or 11 poems. My teacher was great because she typed it out for me and made it into a booklet. And I remember holding, and you have a book that you're making yourself, and when it made me believe that I could write books. And so I remember going home to my mom and telling her I wanted to be a writer. And it's the only thing I ever wanted to be in my life as a writer. So I've done other jobs, but I've always had this dream of being an author, and this is like a dream come true. So I was 8 years old when I wrote my first book.
Such a great question. I just wanted to acknowledge this family because I just think this family is really beautiful, and I was almost crying on my way home thinking, what are you laughing? Anyways, so this is the LaValle family, and they're from Miss
Misplaced.
Thank you. I lost a Cree degree there. So they're a very beautiful family. Last year I followed them on Instagram. They had their children go on a year-long road trip to learn. And these two amazing parents homeschooled their children and gave them such an incredible education of seeing the world and being together. And one of their children here came to our book launch last night and brought his book that he's working on, including the illustrations and the text. And one of the most incredible things I think around this family is how they've all shown up to support the dream of this young person. And I know that the other children do hockey, do swimming, and several other things that I know the whole family rallies around. And to me, I think I turned to my friend Gitz and I was like, holy, that is the dream, a family really rallying around the dreams of each individual person as a group. And, to answer your question, I started writing first when I was, I would say grade 3. I had a teacher, her name was Carol Beitzel, and she said, one day you're gonna write stories. And I just believed her. And I believed her, I believed my family when they supported, your family is supporting you. And I believed them so much that when people told me I couldn't, because they did, or people told me that my writing wasn't any good because they did, I heard those voices louder than the ones that said I couldn't. And so I hope that you also hear, the voices of your mom and dad and your community louder than you hear all the other voices.
And we hope to see you up here one day talking about your future work.
Yeah, that support is so important, and it's wonderful. Yeah, we talked a little bit yesterday. I was drawing from at least 3 or 4, but I didn't do more than a couple pages at a time until I was 16, and then I went way big at that point to a full 22, and I'm like, oh my goodness, that's a lot of work, but it was so nice to have done it. And if I was smarter, I'd have just done a little bit and a little bit and a little bit instead of just trying to cram it all in, but that's the fun of it, is just keep doing it right.
Thank you. We have another question.
Yeah, I'll try to make it quick. I think people want to go home. Okay, first there's a quick story before the question, so you understand the question. But a couple of years ago, I went to this event where Native Indigenous comic book artists were talking about their projects, and a Cree artist used an element from her culture as a time machine, which I thought was clever, and modern, and I appreciate it, but an Anishinaabe elder got up and he was a bit offended by it, by using culture in a modern story. I tried to argue that, well, they're Cree, we're Anishinaabe, that's their business, let them do what they want to do. But anyway, have any of you ever had similar pushback from communities or elders or anyone about your stories and how you portray Indigenous people? Or if you don't want to answer that question, just generally, what are your thoughts about navigating cultural protocols and social sensitivities?
I definitely have, yeah, that's a fear of mine actually, is having an elder stand up and tell me I did something wrong. In all honesty, I fear that every time in any public forum. So how I kind of navigate that is I truly believe that at the seed, at the nucleus of all our teachings is love. And that trumps all the other protocols, like you should do this or you shouldn't do that, is we have to love each other. I think that that's what our ancestors left for us so that we can continue on. And in terms of the traditions in the books, the kids need it. That's the bottom line. The kids need it. They need access somewhere. Not all of our children are going to be able to sit with an elder. Not all, I think of the astronomical number of the children who are swept up in what's known as the child welfare system. We know that some of these children don't have those connections to our families and our communities, but they might come across a book. And if I would rather get heck from an elder than keep something that might save a life. And we know that having that connection to community saves lives. And so it's kind of like a nervous dance that I do. I do think that there is a danger though in some things that people who are outside of our communities read our text and they might think that they are somehow experts or they are somehow have the right to do these ceremonies, have the right to do these things. And so I think that we have some safeguards where we give enough, but we don't give it all, I guess. And I think that that's also a careful dance to navigate. So I don't have the answer, and I just try to do so as carefully and as I can.
I have nothing to add.
So I think we'll leave it there. Thank you so much, everyone, for coming, and thank you to our